Now, just a little warning before we begin, there will be some major spoilers in this video for the first 3 episodes of Kenobi, so if you haven't seen them yet and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Okay, so going into the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, one of the biggest concerns or complaints fans had was with the look of the Grand Inquisitor. We had seen him before in Rebels as well as in the Darth Vader comic books, and let's just say there were some differences in the way he looked in those appearances when compared to the way he was going to look in the Kenobi series. Not to mention, thanks to Revenge of the Sith, we'd seen his species, the Powwoon, before in live action, and there they looked a little more strange alien species and a little less Uncle Fester, I guess. And I know this is where some will complain that Star Wars fans complain too much, which is a little ironic to complain about complaining too much, but whatever. However, in this case, at least me personally, I didn't or wasn't going to try to let it bother me too much the way he looked. I mean, I know it's not always easy taking something from animation and then turning it into live action or to make it look good in live action compared to the way it looks in animation. But this did look pretty low effort, or maybe I should say low budget. Again, especially when you consider we have seen his species in live action before. Still, I was trying to cut them some slack or maybe give them the benefit of the doubt, even though, yes, I do understand why there was all the complaining from the fans the way he looked. I think a lot of people had the mindset that if they put up a big enough fuss, we'd have another sort of Sonic the Hedgehog type moment, where Lucasfilm would realize they dropped the ball so badly with the way the character looked, that they go back and do some CGI work and make him look a little better. However, that didn't happen, and for better or worse, the look of the Grand Inquisitor we got in the trailers was basically the one we got in the actual series. But little did we know before it all started that the way he looked wouldn't even be the biggest sort of controversy with the character, that him being killed off would be, considering we know he's going to be in Rebels, a show that takes place a good 5 years after this one. Which leads to essentially 3 possibilities as to what's going on here, none of which being very good ones or very well thought out, I think. The first is that this is not the same Grand Inquisitor we see in Rebels and or in the Vader comic books. And what's kind of funny about that is I even joked in a video or two going into the series that maybe somehow, some way, they weren't going to be one and the same, and that would explain why this one, the one in the Kenobi series, looks so different. And though I wasn't serious at the time, that has, I guess, become a serious possibility, though the biggest problem with it, beyond it being an incredible coincidence that they'd be the same species, is that there would almost have to be 3 of them, 3 Powwoon Inquisitors that are all or will become the Grand Inquisitor, because again in the Vader comics he looks very, very similar to the way he'll look in Rebels, far different than the way he looks in Kenobi in both cases. Which would almost make it feel like the one in the Vader comics will die at some point, be replaced by the one in the Kenobi series, and now with him being dead, the one from Rebels will eventually somehow take over. And I say eventually because in the series, Fifth Brother seems to believe he's next up to be the Grand Inquisitor, though Reva also has plans of taking his spot, hence why she killed him in the first place, I'd imagine. And again, coincidentally enough, all of these Grand Inquisitors just so happen to be the same species. So are they all brothers or something? Twins? Triplets even? Is cloning involved here, or something even more sinister?
Dark science. Cloning. Secrets only the Sith knew.
Could it somehow be that all of the former Jedi Temple Guards were Powwoon for some reason, and they're keeping some of the other ones in reserve when one dies? And though I'm mostly kidding about that, in Rebels when we learn the Grand Inquisitor indeed used to be a Jedi Temple Guard, he is briefly shown with 2 other Temple Guards who, in terms of body shape or structure, they look pretty much identical to him, implying they could all be, again, the same species, if not actually just triplets. Though yeah, in all reality, they look identical because that was just easier for the animation department to pull off. They didn't have to make different models, they could just repeat the same one. Yet now here we are with a potential, albeit still not a good one, explaining why they did all look the same. Okay, and moving on here, the second possibility, and by far the most likely I think, is that the Grand Inquisitor simply isn't dead, that he survived being stabbed in the stomach and will show up later in the series, at which point Vader will learn that Reva has lied to him about Kenobi having killed the Grand Inquisitor, though in all reality Vader should already suspect her having lied to him, and have his doubts about Obi-Wan being able to kill the Grand Inquisitor after his pathetic showing against Vader in this previous episode. Either way, Vader's likely not going to be happy about Reva lying to him. He's likely going to be more upset about that than her actually having killed the Grand Inquisitor, or thought to have killed him, because I'd imagine the Inquisitors killing each other is something that's more or less just frowned upon, more so than anything else. I'm sure it's certainly not something that's encouraged, if you will. I'm sure Vader just wants them to do whatever task he assigns them to do and cares little about them beyond that at all, beyond their usefulness, I should say. But that said, he's of course going to expect some backstabbing among them, literal backstabbing out of them from time to time as they jockey for position in the hierarchy, all with the hopes of impressing Vader and maybe someday somehow becoming his apprentice. In other words, I don't have an issue with the idea that Reva would kill the Grand Inquisitor, or that she'd lie to Vader about it, and that Vader might just kind of overlook that lie as long as he's still going to get what he wants. I think that all makes sense and portrays the Inquisitors perfectly, and could even show just how ruthless they all are, and Reva in particular. Problem is, when it happened, when she stabbed him, that's not what entered my mind. I wasn't thinking about how cold or power hungry or how ruthless or how badass Reva is. I was thinking the Grand Inquisitor literally cannot die here or it breaks canon. That was it. In other words, they would have been much, much better off showing her having a rivalry with one of the other Inquisitors, one we hadn't seen before and thus is kind of disposable, and having her kill that one. And yes, I realize they're already setting something like that up with Fifth Brother, and I'm waiting for them, for Reva and Fifth Brother, to eventually have some sort of fight or duel, and for Reva to kill him too, despite him also being in Rebels. I mean, at this point, why not, right? Even though it'd actually make far more sense for Fifth Brother to kill her, since Reva is not in Rebels or seen anywhere else, yet, I suppose. And look, I get that for whatever reason they really want to tell some type of story with Reva. They really want to build this character in this series. But this is a really dumb way to do it, because more than likely the Grand Inquisitor, yes, is still alive and will come back, which just makes her look foolish for not making sure he was dead, especially before she went and told Vader. It's also, as I was saying before, distracting to any fan or anyone in general who happens to know the Grand Inquisitor is in Rebels, a show that takes place after this one. I'm far more concerned about that, how this is going to fit into the canon, than I'm finding this in any way some sort of exciting character building moment for Reva, because it feels more like a canon deconstructing moment to build a character for the sake of building a character, and continuity be damned. Not to mention, if he does come back, if the Grand Inquisitor is still alive, and he likely is, well, that's kind of becoming the oldest trick in the Lucasfilm playbook at this point, to tease or imply a character's death just to bring him back a little while later. And yeah, he's a dark side user, and he is somewhat strong with the Force, and maybe he used his anger to survive the wound. Maul did that to survive a much worse injury, after all. Or maybe anatomy is at play here, and Reva's gut shot somehow missed all his vital organs, and he's fine, he was just playing dead. Though why he hasn't gone back to report Reva's betrayal to Vader is in question, unless he's afraid to go back to Vader until he proves himself some other way after this failure. But one way or another, him surviving this, another character surviving like this when implied to be killed, is going to be another eye-roll inducing moment. The third and final option here, and the least likely, is that they're just breaking canon and don't care. And according to Joby Harold, the writer of the series, this isn't the case. In a recent article or recent interview, he had this to say. As you know, we would never break canon, so that's all I'll say. Canon is everything. I can't speak to it beyond that. We all know where we're going in the show, so anytime you can undercut that, pull the rug on that, have a reversal. I was sitting with Rupert Friend, who plays the Grand Inquisitor. I was right in front of him when it happened, and we talked about it beforehand. I was like, how is this going to be? It was an audible gasp. The people were not expecting that at all. That was quite gratifying because that's the intention to show. It begins with the Grand Inquisitor, well, grandstanding and enjoying the sound of his own voice. I don't think we anticipate that voice suddenly being cut off as it was. Okay, so by the sound of it, it seems like one of the first two options I discussed has to be the right answer, with again, I think it being most likely that he just survives somehow, which is again the problem and why I completely disagree with what Joby Harold says here. When it happened, when the Grand Inquisitor was quote-unquote killed by Reva, I didn't feel surprised or like you'd subverted my expectations or undercut what I thought would happen. I didn't gasp or anything like that because I knew Reva couldn't have just killed him without, again, breaking canon or there being some silly contrivances or coincidences where there is another Grand Inquisitor that'll look just like him, or that he won't end up being dead at all. And thus I also knew you were trying to create a moment or something significant for Reva without actually doing or accomplishing anything when you really think about it, because I knew you most likely weren't breaking the canon, which is all I was thinking about in that moment, not what it meant for the character at all. In other words, to put it bluntly, and considering most fans I've seen talking about this have the same problems with the moment, that they're more concerned about what this means for the Grand Inquisitor than anything it does for Reva. So you failed with this scene or with this moment, and the only thing that's actually going to be undercut is your story when the character eventually comes back. This all reminds me a lot of the whole Chewbacca dying in The Rise of Skywalker, seemingly at the fault of Rey, only to show up like 2 minutes later and just undercut that whole thing. Or C-3PO having his memory wiped in the same film, only to get it back at the end. Again, you're not undercutting anything but your own story. And so, in closing here, my guess is that the Grand Inquisitor shows back up again in one of the final episodes, maybe the final episode, and then undercuts a plan of Reva's, which will make this whole silly thing come full circle. Or who knows, maybe he really does just have a twin brother with a less round head. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me which option do you think is most likely. Is he still alive, or does he have a twin brother out there somewhere? And how do you feel about this? Does this work for Reva? Is this a character building moment? Or were you just left scratching your head as to how could the Grand Inquisitor be killed? Whatever the case may be, take to the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.